because there are two of us, we're really going to try and have a conversation about our work rather than delivering a formal lecture. I suppose also because we're expecting questions from you, and we believe the idea of this evening is to have a dialogue. So the first dialogue probably will be between Yvonne and myself as we try to take you through our work. We use this term architecture as new geography because we believe that the role of architects and responsibility of architects is in the making of place. And this is a monument in the countryside in Ireland. And this is obviously the city centre, Grafton Street, which is where our name comes from. So we step from our quiet studio onto this busy street every day. We love the work of Manuel de Sola Morales, the way he writes about city and the way he talks about getting under the skin of city. And I suppose as architects, we talk about the idea that, like Oskar Kokoschka looking at Berlin, we as architects have to try to record city in terms of sensation, not just in terms of pattern, in terms of sensation, and we have to record cities in an optimistic way.
Just in terms of recording city, recently someone was describing painting or drawing for 3 hours, drawing the same thing for 1 hour, drawing the same thing for 15 minutes, then drawing the same thing for 5 minutes, and then for 1 minute. And at that point that you find the essence. And going back to the previous image where Shelley was describing that in the world of artists they describe sensation, the issue of, or the profession of architecture is also to make new sensations, but also to find a method, an analytical method of actually getting to that point. So drawing and analysing and understanding the sensation of city, we as a profession have to take sensation, understand what it is, find out how to make it and make it again. So the relationship with other disciplines is really very important. And this piece from Rafael Moneo was in the recent Biennale, and it really touched our hearts in terms of understanding city as a phenomenon. So he says, a city that accompanies you, the city you travel in and with.
I suppose we think about this in the context of working in other cities, that to work in another place, you need to know your own place in a very deep and considered way. And that term, the city you travel in and with, is very telling philosophically, especially when we talk about global travel, that really, unless you're grounded and connected in a deep way in your own culture, you can't really read or make any contribution to another culture. And Dublin is the city that we have learned how to work in. We've been practicing there for 30 years. And we continually find the things, as you do, I'm sure, in Milan, that the things that you see every day, the more you look, the more you find. These brick streets in Dublin, we continually learn from the fact that they make rooms which are full of light, which are really elegant, but at the same time, the proportion of solid to void is 70 to 50%. So we ask ourselves, why do we make so many glass buildings if you can make beautiful rooms full of light with a lot of surface? And it's also about difference and repetition and organic architecture, which has a sense of repetition but also an ability to change. And this painting by Michael Caine, a Dublin painter, again touching on the sensation of these red brick streets. In
1991, some years before that, a group of us who shared a same, if you like, value and joy of living in Dublin City came together to make an exhibition in the museum, Hugh Lane Museum Art Gallery in Dublin, Making a Modern Street. And because we had formed a loose alliance, when a competition for a very large area in the centre of Dublin became a competition, we formed a loose association called Group 91. We were 8 small practices, maybe with 3 or 4 people in each practice, and working together we made a submission for this competition and we won it. There's two things to remember about this as young architects, and I'm aware that the room is full of young architects, that the lifetime of an architect really is so linked to economic structure that we really have to find ways of surviving in the lean times as well as the full times. And in 1991, the small practices, which was us with our 7 colleagues, won this competition, and each of the practices got a project to build within the area. Now it's very interesting, this is 1991, it was built shortly afterwards, and now you can look at how cities either survive or not. People who go to Dublin, it's interesting because of, it's become the kind of drinking centre of Dublin, it's a tourist centre, certain things have been successful, but I think we could also say that because there wasn't, if you like, the real push for living in the city. I mean, if you look at the top of this drawing, a community of 3,000 citizens living, I think certain aspects of this competition have been very successful, but other aspects have not achieved their goals. But that's the, if you like, the hindsight of time.
Well, I think also that this project was about addition and no subtraction. So from very early on, working in Dublin, we've been adding stitching and repairing, making small insertions like this this site, which is this little, which is the pointer even?
It's the middle one.
The small insertion into the urban block, and you build up a repertoire in making these kind of stitches and repairs in a city, which forms your view as to how to work in a city and how to continue the tradition of city. I suppose the point also about the previous competition is the importance of collaboration and the importance of a cohesive architectural culture within any country or within any city, because we all feed off that. This new Department of Finance building was very much influenced by this building in Stockholm by Celsing. And we were talking today wondering why it is that we always seem to be drawn towards buildings which have a sense of mass and a sense of weight. And I think it's to do with that sense of trying to bring the ancient and the contemporary together. And there's a beautiful description of the Celsing building where it's described as a large corporate building with prehistoric overtones. And I think what we're going to touch on this evening is just streams in our work that we're trying to reach back into the deep past and at the same time to make new insertions into our own city and into other cities.
And if I could just say something on the Celsing and on the project in Dublin, that as architects, when you go to a mountain and when you take the stone from a mountain, which Celsing did and which we did in this project where we take limestone from a quarry in the middle of Ireland, that there is a responsibility. As architects, we are taking down mountains to build, if you like, and that when you make a building, that is not just stone as something that you specify. This is stone from the earth made in geological time. So when you lift it from one condition to another, I think we as architects really have to have a sense of responsibility. In this building, the image on the screen, the limestone is 100 millimeters thick and 100 millimeters tall, and it varies from 900 millimeters to 1.2. So we have taken pieces of the earth, Celsing took pieces of the earth, and it's also that sense of when you use a material, you are actually taking something that exists and transforming it.
And I suppose you have to give something back to make it worth that. I mean, in Bocconi, they actually bought the mountain to find the ceppo to build the building, and we were really humbled by that you were taking a piece of landscape and bringing it into the city. In terms of making places, and this thing we say about architecture is new geography, this university on a greenfield site in the west of Ireland was extremely challenging for us in the sense that it was the kind of contrast of open landscape adjacent to a very beautiful Georgian city. And we were asked to make a new space with a medical school and student accommodation. And I suppose the thing that we find is that each place you go to has completely different challenges and draws on your fluency and your language and your your sense of the civic. What we were trying to do here was to make a student housing feel like it had a civic presence because it had to take its place beside a new medical school. And we were also dealing with the wind and rain of the west of Ireland. So we were taking the same stone, because this happens to be a limestone county, but using it in a much more open way because we're in the countryside as opposed to being in the city. And this thing of new geography and making new space, whether you're dealing with the organic or the dense urban, the responsibility is always, what is the space or the place that you make? What does it feel like?
In terms of the section, this is moving into the medical school, and the next image is really one of a vessel of light. For us, this is really important, how to carve, how to use the section, how to bring light into a deep plan, and how to control light. I was talking today, somebody told me last week, I don't know the actual piece of literature, but seemingly Codet, the Spanish architect, said that light was the cheapest material that architects can use. And it's just very interesting to think of it as not just the void in the specification, but it is the material that we as architects have free, gratis. That's what we carve with.
Yvonne talks about the section being to do with emotion and the plan being to do with the rational, and we always have this argument because I see emotion in plans, but you think that it's the volumetric interaction that's really the core of a project. And I suppose especially in educational projects, that thing of the interaction of volumes is hugely important because that's to do with making the overlap of people. This building is also to do with economy because we had to make it's like a very tight ship which takes light from above and takes light obviously from the edges, but it's a very economical form. But it's really to do with that thing of making a kind of magic box of spaces within which education can happen. And in this case, it's a medical school, and the ethos of this medical school has actually been inspired by the way that architecture schools run based on studios and the discovery of knowledge. And that's something in the questions we received in advance from the students. There are some questions about education. And that's one of the things we often talk about is what are places of education? Are they places where people consume knowledge, or are they places where people discover knowledge? And these doctors felt that schools of architecture were where students discover knowledge. You don't consume, you have to discover how to make, you're taught obviously and you're helped, but there's so much discovery in the way that architecture is taught, which is very refreshing.
Sorry, Shelley, can we just go back to this image here? Because we are in a school of architecture, one of the things that's really important in making these drawings and in making models, that it's a three-dimensional, that maybe there's a discussion in schools of architecture now where maybe physical models are not made as much, and that I think that it's something that is really very important in the making of these kind of drawings and these kind of spaces, that you go beyond the drawing and that you take the, if you like, the requirements of clients and you see what can it be. So these sections are also checked in model form, in physical models, and made kind of awkward early models to actually study relationships.
And I suppose there's also a continuity of language. We were speaking earlier today about how we made a response to Bocconi and how we responded to Milan, and a colleague of ours, when they saw this building in Limerick, said that it felt like a piece of Milan in the west of Ireland, which is kind of strange exchange, but it was an interesting comment. But really this project is about making place, bringing housing together with an educational institution, and trying to make a space which will anticipate the life of the future.
We want to spend a little time on this particular slide. This is really very important to us in terms of what we call the hieroglyphics of architecture. And they are not, if you like, you can't describe them as scribbles. They are hieroglyphics in the way that scientists will look at the DNA of a project or a DNA of a plant or an organism. So what we have here, if I can borrow that for take Shell, that we have, thanks, that we have here is a section which is, if you like, the DNA of our project in Lima in Peru. This is a drawing that came out of a conversation that we had with Méndez de Rocha in Skype form across the world, trying to find a way of working with Annette Spiro, who has written a wonderful book on Méndez de Rocha's work. And we were trying to find common ground, which was the theme of David Chipperfield's Venice Biennale, where we were trying to find a common ground. And this line is representing a datum, and these pieces here represent the timber foundations and structure which anchor Venice into the mud of the Adriatic. And Méndez de Rocha describes Venice as the capital of the imagined world. And for us, this was a really important section line that we go, and I think it's something very important also because we're aware that you are students. It is also the ground below that affects the architecture above. These then are some of Méndez de Rocha's work talking about ground and carving, and these two pieces here are Machu Picchu in Peru and a place called Skellig Michel, which is an island off the west coast of Ireland, where there is, if you like, a monastery that was built between the 8th and the 11th century. And what we were amazed at in terms of our research is the relationship between Machu Picchu, which is in the 1500s, and the 9th and 10th and 11th century relationship to Ireland in terms of dry stone construction, in terms of that space between the major move of landscape at the large scale and then the intimate. This is a section which we'll describe in a while. This is an important section for us in terms of Milan. The 1,000 offices seen as an upper skyscape with the cuts, the courtyards, and the corroded and erupted and carved groundscape. This is a project which is built in a town about an hour's drive north of Dublin, looking at the relationship of bodies of audience, looking at the work of Sharoon, seeing how audiences relate to one another. This section in this drawing here is a project which is really describing the DNA of a project that we have on site at the moment in the beautiful French city of Toulouse. And what is beautiful, I think, about this drawing is taking the research offices, making them into, if you like, getting the measure of them, understanding, I suppose, in terms of discussing our work with you as a student body, is that each project has a certain dimension, not just in square meters and cubic meters, but also it has, if you like, functional relationships. So in this case, which we'll describe later on, it's taking some of the specials, making a vertical 21st century courtyard, environmentally locking this new building into a traditional city.
But I suppose the thing that we've been talking about in relation to these sketches was that you talk about them being like hieroglyphic pieces, that when you're making a project, you're continually looking for something. You're looking for the project. There's a kind of hidden meaning that you haven't found yet. And I think that's what these kind of sketches describe, which all architects make, but which we just put together on this wall to say that the process of working as an architect is you're searching. You're making these drawings which look really crude, but as Yvonne says, the more you try to encapsulate in a sketch or in this summary of the measure or the issue or the challenge of a project, the clearer it is in terms of proceeding. I think that's really the point is not to underestimate that ability to interpret in a loose sketch what it is that you're being asked to do. We're just going to use, you're all familiar with Bocconi, and Yvonne has spoken here before, so we don't want to repeat ourselves, but just to celebrate again, for us, coming back to Milan and going back to Bocconi is always an exciting thing. The roof of the Duomo, I think, changed our lives in terms of thinking about man-made landscape floating above the city, and then us thinking about how to rationalize 1,000 professors over what we called an undulating new urban landscape.
But can I just say, just going back to the previous one, the thing about the drawing is also that when you are with a notebook, with a pencil, with a scale rule, and you're given a task, if you like, of housing whatever your project might be, it's also understanding that offices are not 1 metre wide and 12 metres deep, that there's a certain size and measure of the thing that you as architects are asked to put together.
It's like music.
Yeah, to get the note right. And I think that this lower drawing, I mean this one here, is really saying how do you organize 1,000 offices? We said at another time you could have 1,000 offices with a corridor with 500 doors on either side, but there's no choice and no measure and no decision about what is too long, what's too short, what's too big. So I think there's judgment, which I think also, especially in schools of architecture, that you don't lose the fact that you are a rational human being and you know that a corridor that's 500 doors long with no light is too long. And that judgment is also, I think sometimes that in schools of architecture or as architects, young architects particularly, forget that they have a logic and that they are scientists as well, so that these drawings are important.
Somebody like, and we're not going to describe projects, we're just really going to describe themes. Something that Inaki Abalos talks about in a wonderful book called The Good Life. He talks about poetic irrationality. So it's a combination of us as scientific, rational beings, but at the same time making subjective responses to things, being able to, as Yvonne says, to organize, to think about structure, to think about the implications of structure in terms of space, because structure isn't interesting in itself necessarily, it's interesting in what it does in making intimate space or in liberating space, in ordering space. And I suppose the other thing that we've been talking about recently is that it takes you a long time to realize as an architect and which was the strangest, most exciting project we'd seen in a very long time, which is a church that he has done, where the floor of the church floats over a body of water and it feels like a big rock. And we found that project really useful in terms of how we could think about the corner of Viale Blini and Röntgen, that it would feel like this big boulder which is rising out of the ground and allowing the life of the city to flood the undercroft. I suppose this photograph by Sudek, a photographer I love, is in Prague. It's called Night Walk. But what we were talking about in relation to this photograph is that it's interesting in that it describes habitation. It doesn't describe form, and it reminds us that architecture is a framework that hosts private lives. He talks about a community of secret individuals overlooking a public space. And that's something that came up in conversations today as well, is what our role is as architects, and that's maybe why we talk about architecture as new geography, that as more and more people come to live in cities, that our responsibility of architecture as architects is so much about making places for strangers, making places for friends, making pieces of city. But this image describes habitation, and that's our first role, in a sense, is how to make places which people can inhabit, be they public or private.
I'd also like to say that in the same way as the media supports the visual, supports the eye as the arbitrator of so-called beauty in architecture, the iconic piece, we know as architects that architecture is a full bodily experience. As architects, we have to challenge the visual and champion the experiential. Architecture is for the body, eyes, ears, nose, skin. We walk through and feel spaces with our whole bodies and all our senses, not just with our eyes or with our minds. We are fully involved in the experience. This is what makes us human. When architecture is referred to as the mother of the arts, it is describing that all-encompassing nature of building, which actually envelops you, doing so over time, each day, throughout the seasons. Architecture acts as the expression of and protector of our humanity. This is the same contemporary issue that the media pressure on young people to be superstars, to undervalue themselves because of image pressures. Surely it needs us who have experienced life, especially as architects, who know that the value of architecture is not about image, but about experience, quality, depth, reality, that there is no real need to challenge there is a real need to challenge and expand on this issue. And buildings grow old, they experience the elements and the seasons through time, and they have to last. They are not just the first shiny photographs of a magazine. And that's why we show you this image tonight, because it is so provocative. People are living in those rooms. People are up here in these places living. The architecture at one level doesn't matter. It is not only the visual. Yes, it is visual, it is material, but it is the place in which the human being begins their day, begins and moves out into the world. So it's
what
really.
Do you mean it doesn't matter then?
It doesn't matter to the same extent as if you like, the visual, the pressure of the visual nowadays is so strong that you will look at a building and say, I like it or I don't. That we really have to train ourselves as architects, especially as students of architecture, that you sometimes not quite blindfold yourself, but go into places and say, do I feel good in this place? Do I like it? It might be very ordinary, but something about it in its relationship, or something about, just be careful of the media, especially your generation. You are the generation of the quick hit. You can iPhone into anywhere in the world, and it's visual. The iPhone is an incredible invention, but it is a visual, and so really what we're saying is that be careful. As architects, you usually make things that last, and you stand in a place, you open a door, you go in. We had this interesting conversation on the way here with Stefano about, I heard a conversation recently with a man called Paul Adams in Facebook, and he was saying that we have to understand both history and we have to understand sociology in the impact of the technology that's part of your world in terms of social media and whatever. That the consequence of the motor car, the huge consequence on city, this new invention, which was a kind of a motorized cart, changed architecture. There is a very interesting question which is not answered, but you are part of an era where place is completely different. You can talk to your friend on the Great Wall of China in the same way as the friend is having a picnic on the beach in California. Simultaneously, you can Skype. So it questions what the role of architecture is when you can be everywhere at the same time.
I'm just thinking this conversation is becoming one-sided.
Okay, I'll end that rant.
Yvonne won't stop talking, so I have to interrupt her. So after that, I'll just talk about Baudelaire for 10 minutes. Is that okay? I was reading recently that Baudelaire's description of modernity is wonderful, where he talks about the modern being about the contingent and the transigent, and that's one half of art, and that the other half is about the unchanging and the timeless. And I think architecture is happily embedded in that situation where we're dealing with change, which is wonderful, which is renewing, and we're also we have our feet solid in the ground and in the past. Toulouse it was the next project we did after Bocconi, a completely different challenge, a beautiful brick city. Our site is adjacent to the medieval city, and we were really challenged just talking about this thing of I suppose in a way Milan was more familiar to us in that it was part of the rational part of Milan urban blocks. Toulouse was this organic, labyrinthine, medieval place with this strange shaped site, so we had to think about it in a completely different way and at a completely different scale. And climatically, it's completely different, where it has these, it's 40 degrees in the summer. I know Milan gets that hot as well, but it's a very different light, very different climate, and very different context. And these beautiful courtyards which make these windows to the sky. And Yvonne talked earlier about the sketch, and the difference between, it's exactly the same brief as Bocconi, which is research offices for professors. It's the School of Economics as well, and auditoria. And we took this whole building, we took all the public rooms out of the ground and thought about it like a big brick wall through which you make, or in which you make windows to the city. And it's, as I say, it's in this strange prow-shaped part of Toulouse, beside a medieval wall, beside which we had to take our place. And we came as close as possible to this medieval wall. We put all the public rooms to the front, made these big windows and cuts to the big river, the canal and the river, which is a beautiful draw. And we think about this as being like a carved solid. It's like the building is inhaling and exhaling to take the city in with it. And again, all the circulation is like a lot of the circulation in Bocconi, it's external, which is a real liberation for us coming from Ireland, because it's not possible to do that in Ireland. And just talking about fragments, it was very much to do with taking the cloisters and the colonnades and the buttresses that we found in Toulouse and using these to start to make a form. And again, trying to draw the city into the social heart of the university, where it relates to this very vibrant student square. And taking the thing of making big rooms and windows at the scale of city, that somehow you have the windows of the little offices, but you also have the, again, I suppose it's thinking about working at different scales. You're working at the scale of the intimate and the office, but you're also trying to make something which makes connections with the bigger world, which we were trying to do here, that we would choreograph the connections to wonderful buildings and to the city beyond.
I'd just like to say two things on this image. One is that architecture is a cultural issue, and that one of the things that we find in the great fortune to be building in Dublin or Milan or in Toulouse or in Lima, that we're really trying to find and trying to understand the social and cultural component of a particular place on this earth. And what I love about this image is that we also want people, when they're in the building, to be aware that they are in Toulouse, that they're not in Jeddah, or they're not in Alaska, or they're not somewhere else contained within a kind of architecture that can be anywhere. What interests us, I suppose, is that every place is unique, and that architecture's role can be a cultural one, to claim those unique, not just a GPS position on the earth from a particular piece of technology, but that as you go to work every day, that you are aware that you can see the Garonne in the outside the window, or you can see a Canal de Brienne which comes in, or the medieval wall, or the Romanesque church. That architecture is placed in a particular place on this planet. And I think that's what, for us, I suppose, that's when Shelley used the word choreography, that you also choreograph like a filmmaker, that this is Toulouse, this is Milan, this is Dublin, that is, as architects, you have choices as you grow older and become, practicing architects, this room of architectural students, that you have a choice about where in the spectrum of architectural challenge that you take up the baton. Is it a cultural phenomenon for you? Is it just a building that you just build anywhere and you can plonk it down anywhere on the earth? I mean, these are important questions in terms of sustainability. And embedded in work, I think it's also true to say that in this, as Shelley described, the position, if you like, the climatic condition, not just the cultural one, actually allows a certain sustainability which gives rise to a certain kind of space making. So sustainability is not a green roof that you put on to get all your BREEAM points, but it's embedded deeply, just like structure and architecture and environmental engineering is architecture, that it's really, we have to claim back sociology, culture, environmental science into the container.
But I suppose also the courtyards in Toulouse are quite different to the courtyards in Milan. The staircases seem more open. There are not so many doors. Actually, I met a professor of architecture there, and he said to me, "You English," he thought we were English, which is not a good start. He said, "You English have front gardens which appear open, but they're closed. And here in Toulouse we have walls, but all our houses are open." And he explained to us that those houses, the courtyard I showed you, that they had a secret labyrinthine set of corridors, and because the blocks were so deep and the medieval city was so dense, that people could walk through these secret labyrinthine places. And what changed that in Toulouse was the intercom, because people could get doorbells and could have their door opened remotely. And that's also very interesting in terms of how urban blocks and how the story of a city, how you can access the story of a city in order to make your own story. And what we were trying to do here was to make a courtyard which had that open, airy feeling of the courtyards that we found in Toulouse, with open staircases and that sense of not being defensive, and at the same time making an architecture which expresses a contemporary need, and at the same time takes up its place in the landscape of the city, and using the same brick as the medieval wall. The factory we found 1 hour away from Toulouse, they say that it's exactly the same brick as the Romans used, the same mold, the same earth, the same everything. And that's a real pleasure for us to be able to take the ancient material of a city and reuse it in our own work. This amazing building we went to see when we were looking at the site in Toulouse, and it's about 1 hour from Toulouse. It's a town called Albi, and it's a cathedral designed by a Spanish engineer architect, and it has this incredible presence which is part industrial, part ecclesiastical. And it always reminds me of a beautiful essay written by Professor David Leatherborough, who teaches in Penn University, and he talks about what he calls thresholds and edges, and the way that the buildings meet the ground has social significance. He talks about, and it's a very interesting thing, instead of thinking about elevations, which always scares us as architects, it's the hardest thing to do, to think about thresholds and edges and how buildings hit the ground. And he talks about light and shade. If you make a shady space in a hot country, well then it generates social activity. If you in Ireland, if you give protection from the wind and the rain, people gather. So it's for us, it's a very liberating way of thinking about edges, about buildings, about elevations. A.S. Byatt, wonderful critic and writer, talks about language and an experiment she did where she cut up the words of D.H. Lawrence and E.M. Forster and made collages. And she talked about the breathings of the world, of the words, were interchangeable. And we touched earlier on this thing of fragments and how we work as architects. And in a sense, that is really interesting, that the breathings of the references that one takes subjectively in one way, but not fully subjectively, because one needs judgment more than most things as an architect. And this is the wall of our office at the moment, where we're looking at all different kinds of influences in terms of making our project in Lima, ranging from the most ancient to Urbino, to bits of Milan, to whatever, bits of Dublin. And I suppose the point we're trying to make in this is that the way the photographers capture spaces is also fascinating, because the photograph holds a moment in time. And in a sense, if we think about us as architects or just as human beings, if you think about what happened a month ago that was important to you, you don't think in a linear, rational way. You think in fragments of taste or smell or the light or what somebody said. And in a sense, when we're working as architects, we're taking those fragments and trying to make a construct. But these photographs, again, Sudek, he talks here about making a tiny landscape within a sacred space. It's actually a cathedral in Prague, which is under reconstruction, but he takes the wheelbarrow and the earth, and that's something we're really interested in, is when does landscape stop and building begin? And I suppose that comes back to the idea of architecture as new geography, but it also makes you think about light. The light looks so liquid in this, or then you start to think about liquid and water and the force of the sea on this wonderful new pier in Porto by Carlos Prata, and then you start to think in Lima that the fog, which if you think Milan is foggy, I mean Lima is just unbelievable, where this fog comes down for something like 75% of the year and envelops the city. But what's amazing about it is that Lima, this fog becomes the light, because it refracts the light in such a way that you actually can't open your eyes. So you feel the intensity of the light. You actually don't realize how strong the light is until you're in the fog, which sounds contradictory. But I suppose the point we're making about this is that we have to, not have to, but we could or should or would think about the elements that we're dealing with, of wind or resistance or rain or light or breeze, that it's really interesting to think about things in that kind of basic way. Again, going back to the Louis Barragan thing of seeing with innocence or feeling with innocence.
Can I just go back to this image of in Peru? What is really important when we look at history is that I was this summer in Palma in Mallorca, and in a cloister taking a photograph with my iPhone. The iPhone couldn't handle the amount of light refracted on the series of columns on the cloister, and the columns were not circular, they were carved into 4 smaller circles. So what was happening was that the light, you have a choice as a builder, as an architect, to make a column which is like that. Who decided to make the column not like this as one circle, but in 4 smaller circles? And the consequence of that is that light is refracted in the same way as Shelley is describing that, that liquid refracts light and that light is refracted within Lima, and your description that the light was so intense it catches the back of your eyes and it's hard to see. That this kind of phenomenon is also caused by there's a cold current that comes up from the South Pole, touches the coast of Peru, which is very near the equator, and you get this incredible, if you like, beautiful constant climate, normally in 20 degrees. And what we found then, building, if you like, we were asked to, if you like, make a building. The competition was make a building in this extraordinary place on the other side of the world. And as we began, if you like, we'll just leave this here. We'll read it, the university as an arena for learning. This thought, if you like, developed out of us doing this competition. We didn't have the thought before the competition. It was a direct result of the research and thinking about what would we do to build a university in a city we had never been to on the other side of the world, with 8.5 million people living in a converted desert with 40-meter cliffs that drops down to the Pacific, on a site which is in a valley. If you can see the site here, excuse me. The site is here, this is the Pacific Ocean. There are these valleys which feed into the interior of the city, and our site was in the point of one of these valleys. What was extraordinary for us in the analysis of the project was that on one side of the site you had an incredibly busy motorway, and on the other side you had a very gentle and beautiful a residential area called Barranco. So we had this, if you like, a shift line between incredibly busy, incredibly quiet, and we were near cliffs which were beside the Pacific Ocean. And in the analysis for us of the project, it was a series, this is a new university of engineering called UTEC in Peru. And when we analyzed the contents of the brief, the list of areas required by the new institution, they were large laboratories, smaller laboratories, classrooms, offices. So it became possible for us to make this fault line between, or if you like, shoulder to the busy motorway to the quiet residential by actually using the section in this way. So we developed this kind of possibility of making a new cliff, of thinking about stadium. Why can't a university be a stadium or an arena for learning? But also it was the issue of South America and the fact that the climate and the culture of inside-outside is not like in Norway. If you stand outside in the winter in Norway, you could die. If you stand outside in the winter, so-called winter in Peru, you just have another pisco sour and have another conversation. It is an amazing climate of being gentle inside and outside. So if you want to refer to structure.
We were talking, well, I think, yeah, we discovered this, particularly this project by Villanova Artigas when we were doing Milan. And we found that really inspirational in terms of thinking about buildings and infrastructure, and buildings as being inhabited infrastructure. And I suppose, I mean, answers do come from place, but they also come from your baggage or your influences as an architect. And when we were looking at Lima, we were looking at this project by Le Corbusier, and we were also looking at a project of one of our teachers in London, where he made this housing project backing onto a railway line, and we were looking at Eduardo Soto de Moro's stadium. And then we went on to develop this idea of the university as an arena for learning, and making this big kind of piece of infrastructure like a viaduct, which would be inhabited by teaching spaces. And one of the architects in our office had visited Lima, and she knew what it was like. She had lived there for some time and kept talking about the fog. And we were making this image of what the building would feel like in the fog, so it disappears up into the sky. So on the one side, it feels like a piece of inhabited infrastructure onto the motorway, and it feels like a part of the cliff, we hope, using the same colour concrete as the cliff. We're hoping that it will have that sense of continuity, and we have this idea of trapping landscape within this form, which has to, because it's a seismic area, there's the whole issue of safety and evacuation, and so the staircases in this case become a primary part of the structure. And then on the Barranco side, like our teacher's project in London, which is housing, it makes this shoulder, as Yvonne says, to the motorway, but then this makes this series of cascading gardens onto this beautiful residential district. So it was interesting the way that this typology crept into our thinking about places of education, that you could think about inhabiting a sports arena and making it into a university, and that became a very interesting idea.
But there's also going back to the previous image, thanks, Shell, that there's also the possibility of one surface below becoming something else. I mean, if you look at the work of Siedl and Hallen, and you look at the Atelier 5 and the beautiful Siedl and Hallen in Switzerland, they have taken, if you like, a legacy of the Rock and Rob project by Le Corbusier. They have translated it into art of Switzerland, and it becomes, if you like, landscaped over time. And in our case here, in this section for the competition, we were using not only the stacking effect of the smaller rooms below being useful surfaces, being, if you like, the new geography, that it also meant that it gave scale and intimacy between the small rooms of the library or the classrooms to the city of Lima, which is 8.5 million. And this section, I mean, it's interesting in terms of the seismic this is a kind of a, if you like, an architectural hunch, that when you kind of lean back, it's like as if you lean back and your 2 feet and your knees are acting in a particular way. This also, in terms of our structural engineering in Lima, is actually very strong in terms of the seismic forces. I mean, the issue of the section really allows our, if you like, that the structure and the organization spatially are linked together, so that students still relate to the motorway, still relate to Barranco, but also to the distance.
And looking at how the building is embedded in the ground, with all the large spaces almost buried, and making protective crust to the educational spaces, getting lighter as you move up into the building, and how it will read from the motorway, and then the development of this into a kind of conglomerate, into an intensely inhabited piece of infrastructure with these gardens and teaching spaces facing Barranco, and then all the circulation of the students overlooking the big city. And that enormity of the scale on the one side and the intimacy on the other was really important in terms of our thinking. And looking at images, this was very much influenced by an image by Villanueva, and the tone of the light, and how we would trap that light or use that light in the making of the public spaces of the university. What was very interesting was that we were asked to be part of the Venice Biennale just after we had won this exhibition, and we called this From Ruin to Realization, because it was a very young project, not designed in detail, but we wanted to present it in the Venice Biennale, and we also wanted to pay homage to the influence that the work of South American architects had on us, especially Paulo Mendes de Rocha. And when we talk about from ruin to realization, we had to take fragments of our project and take them on their own, I suppose, and look at them almost like ruins, but ruins of the future, so that we had to imagine their future as opposed to maybe bemoan their past. And we found things in these amazing constructs in Lima, which are called huacas. And what we found really interesting about these, they're made in mud bricks, but they're monuments to balance man with nature. They're collectively built, they're monumental, but they're not assertive. And there was something really moving about that you would have this sense of monument built by a community in an organic way, like an organic mountain.
The thing that really struck us was that each brick has a type of personality. You could imagine families being either commandeered or encouraged to put together the brick that make this kind of mountain. And in terms of architecture as a new geography, I mean, what is amazing is that, and it is not just for architects but also for humanity, that these places are places of wonder, that you go to these. We had never been to Peru before we won this competition, that you find these places that are extraordinary, are part of another history, and they enrich, if you like, cultural life.
But I suppose it was also because we were talking about architecture as new geography, and we were talking about making a new landscape and about making a new cliff. And so this building, this monument up the road was really influencing our thinking in terms of how we would weave the organic into this big infrastructure, in terms of how this piece of structure could hit a sloping site, and how we could integrate staircases which might feel like external paths in a mountain and not just like the interior of a building, and photographing our models as a way of trying to inform our work, and at the same time looking at projects like the Salk Institute by Louis Kahn, and looking at these kind of interwoven, unending kind of spaces, and how the secondary spaces are in this project were really a revelation. And watching our project become more and more developed in terms of structure, realizing that there's issues of acoustics and noise, where we needed to place rooms to make the infrastructural part more inhabited onto the motorway, finding it was getting very extremely dense, and it really was starting to feel like a cliff This is the model in our office, and wondering about how this building should hit the ground, going back to one of the buildings we looked at for the Venice Biennale, again by Paolo Mendes de Rocha. It's a sports building where he talks about making a cave or making a tent, and that his work somehow oscillates between the cave and tent. And this is the ground model of our Lima project, and going back to the Unité in terms of how buildings hit the ground and how staircases and structure make that connection between ground and a sky, and how a staircase can feel like a rope ladder, or can feel like a ramp, or can feel like a mountain path. And then looking again at the tent component of Mendes de Rocha, and finding that in our structure in Lima, that using a ribbed slab suddenly transforms the spaces from being that there's something about a ribbed concrete slab making a building feel lighter, that it has that sense of being of floating more than a flat concrete slab, and us working with that that thing of the structure, how we inhabit it, how we inhabit the structure, how we make these series of spaces which interconnect, make connections between gardens on one side and the city on the other, and how we use staircases and trapped landscape. And again, here there was a whole struggle for us in terms of Lima, because the light is very strong, but it's also cloudy and foggy. And we did a lot of studies to see, well, how dark will it be when it's really foggy, and will it be really depressing, and how bright will it be on sunny days. So it was that environmental thing, but it's also the thing of not being afraid to make dark spaces in buildings, that light is important, but the darkness is also important. That thing of moodiness and moving from the dark to the half-light to the light, that sequence is a really important thing.
Just in kind of summary now, we just want to recap that we have discussed city in terms of weight. We have discussed materiality and light. If you like, synthesis of drawings. Those sketches are really about translating need into space. We have talked about sensation, where artists, if you like, are observing and recording, and as architects we really have to construct sensation. We talked about brick and light and place, the reading of place. We touched on unconscious influences that may have been part of our early education as architects coming to the fore. We talked about appropriateness, of finding the story of each project, trying to find the cultural connections. We value section and relationships. We find, if you like, wonder in man-made constructions, what we call new geography, and that we are the trapping of space and the making of space, and as translators of need into space, is really what we are or try to be as architects. Thank you.